Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book number 1205, and it is titled Thomas Paine's Revolt Against the Bible, written by Joseph McCabe, and I think it was copyrighted in 1927. This is part 2, and we start out with chapter 2, and here we go. Chapter 2, Common Sense and the Revolution. When Paine landed on American soil on November 30th of 1774, he was no better known than the Italian or Czech peasant you see landing at New York today. He was 37 years old, an age when genius had usually burst through any bond, but was known only as a boon companion to a few score people in Lewes. Within 6 months, he was the most important and inspiring writer in America. Within 18 months, he had written a book of which his most venomous enemy says that its popularity was unexampled in the history of the press, a work which was one of the mightiest influences on the mind of the new American nation in its great crisis. He reached more people than any other writer did until this age of popular novels and big business. More people in proportion to population than stuff like the Rosary did, and the ideas he implanted in their minds were the inspirations of the new civilization. Another little picture. 10 years ago, on my second visit to America, I was invited by my good friend Mr. Van der Weyde to assist at a Paine banquet. There were 10 of us in a third-rate restaurant up Broadway, and the city clerks and curious waiters and the ladies in tights and spangles who gyrated round us looked on with amazement to see us reverently touch with our fingers a lock of Paine's hair. Had the name been mentioned to them, they would have scanned their memories for some forgotten pugilist or actor. One or two might remember merely that an ex-president of the United States had recently spoken of him as a dirty little atheist. One or two might know that a general of the American army had spluttered with indignation because Ingersoll had, and truly, said that Lincoln had the same religion as Paine. Strange that one loyal servant of the American state should rise so high and another fall so low. Not in the least. Lincoln told the world what he believed. Paine told the world what he, like Lincoln, disbelieved. One of the worst indictments that Christianity brings against itself is the rancor, the unscrupulous and mendacious hatred which its members exhibit to critics. The vilification of Paine, both in England and America, has been stupendous. So reckless has it been that in the large Paine literature in the British National Library, there is a pamphlet of 1793 giving the last words and miserable end of Paine on the French scaffold in that year. And he was alive 16 years afterwards, although his religion was far nearer Christian orthodoxy than that of scores of Christian divines and preachers in today. It is left to rationalists who reject the whole of his theology to rescue his memory from the cantif of lying abuse that 3 generations of preachers have raised over it, and this was the man, speaking soberly, who directed the spirit of America in the great crisis as Washington directed his armies. Paine went to Philadelphia and had many offers of tutorship, but the founder of the Pennsylvania Magazine put a pen in his hands, and he wielded it with such force that he was soon in the editorial chair. The dilettantists who say that we exaggerate his use and importance ought to read the articles he wrote in that first year of his literary career, 1775. In his first published article, he said, "America has now outgrown the state of infancy," and he had already written one article, not yet published, urging the abolition of slavery. In May, he wrote, "Modesty forbids men, separately or collectively, to assume titles. But as all honors even that of kings, originated from the public. The public may justly be called the true fountain of honor. In June, he pleaded for a more enlightened law of marriage and divorce. Naturally, but I quote him here to show the new terse, gripping style he brought to America. As ecstasy abates, coolness succeeds, which often makes way for indifference, and that for neglect. Sure of each other by the nuptial bond, they no longer take any pains to be mutually agreeable. Careless if they displease, and yet angry if reproached, with so little relish for each other's company that anybody else's is more welcome and more entertaining. Common sense instead of the twaddle which was in fashion, and there was more of it, on another great question in July. I am thus far a Quaker that I would gladly agree with all the world to lay aside the use of arms and settle matters by negotiations, but unless the whole world wills, the matter ends, and I take up my musket, and thank heaven he has put it in my power. We have not got beyond that today, and we have only just got beyond the eloquent plea of his August article for justice to women. The American women who shudder at the name of Paine ought to know that his voice was one of the first in America to speak, and with rare feeling, against the wrongs of women. He was one of the first to attack dueling, one of the first to demand the suppression of cruelty to animals, certainly the first man in American letters to put before his readers, and so effectively, such comprehensive idealism. He was feeling his limbs. For the moment, religion and politics were barred by the editor. But not for long. The Lexington massacre had occurred. Franklin was warmly assured the British government in 1774 that one heard in the colony no talk of independence from any person, drunk or sober. I guess that feeling was much as it is in Australia today, especially while there seemed to be a French menace, as there seems to be a Japanese danger in Australia. But even after the initial friction and blunders, the general mind was merely settled into the inertness of its traditional loyalty, and a vast number were violently pro-English. The French minister reported that at Philadelphia, as late as 1778, 3/4 of the population were hostile to the new American government, but Paine consulted only justice and common sense. In October of 1775, he published a serious thought in the Pennsylvania Journal. It enumerated all the colonial sins of Britain and said such things as, I hesitate not for a moment to believe that the Almighty will finally separate America from Britain. Call it independency or what you will. If it is the cause of God and humanity, it will go on. God, he said, would have American dependent upon him. Horrible sentiment, isn't it, my religious friend? The articles in the magazine reached a limited circle of readers, and no doubt Paine, only a few months old at the trade of writing, did not think of a much larger audience for the pamphlet he wrote in the late months of 1775, entitled Common Sense. It appeared on January 10th of 1776, and it spread over America with phenomenal rapidity. Let the reader recall the conditions of the time, the sleepy ways of business, the slow transport, the relative fewness of readers. The total population was less than 4 million. Yet Moncure Conway estimates that 500,000 copies of Common Sense were sold, and if we call it a pamphlet, remember that it was a substantial $50 booklet, published in the lowest practicable price. In the first 3 months, at all events, it sold 120,000 copies. It spread like a fire from end to end of the colonies, and a fierce and fateful fire it kindled wherever it spread. The standard of good writing in those days was the style of the Spectator. One can still admire its dignity and eloquence, but Paine was to inaugurate the new American style. He used language not to weave pretty word patterns, but to say things and say them with the effect of immediate conviction. Randolph, the Attorney General, said that Paine poured forth in a style hitherto unknown on this side of the Atlantic, from the ease with which it insinuated itself into the hearts of the people who were unlearned. Sir Leslie Stephen, who knew more than most men about such matters, said that Paine was unequaled as a pamphleteer in revolutionary times. His gigantic circulation proves that. The sentence which I have quoted from one of Randolph's letters will serve as an illustration. For the purpose of writing Little Blue Book number 1203, I had to read hundreds of letters of Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and other cultivated men of the time, and the expression is often clumsy and involved. Even in more formal writing, they were far from the terse and forceful style. The directness and plainness which America has done so much to bring into modern English literature, common sense dictated Paine's expression as well as his sentiments. He begins, I am quoting the London edition of 1793. Some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil. Thus, into the heated confusion of the colonial mind at the time came a cold light which had deadly effect. From the then British point of view, even the unlearned found themselves able to follow the true philosophy of politics, and the conclusion was as boldly stated as the guidance was sure. A pretty business indeed for a man, the king, to be allowed 800,000 sterling a year for, and worshipped into the bargain. Of more worth is one honest man to society, and in the sight of God, than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. No man can measure adequately the wide extent of the influences that shape the decision of the colonies, but there is no danger of overestimating the work of common sense in Paine's subsequent pamphlets. And a purer patriotism never burned than this of the man who had been only a year in America. He made not 1 cent out of the stirring works which he put into circulation. My friend Conway makes some strange slip when he says that Paine, in donating the copyright of the cause of independence, forfeited about $250,000. The sum may have been 1/10 that, but it was a vast sacrifice for a man of modest means, at a time when most patriots made money. I remember a conspicuous patriot, a wealthy journalist in London during the Great War. He was asked to give one of a series of helpful lectures and told that the fee was $100. My fee is $250, he said, as I privately learned. Paine seems to have paid for his own copies of his book. In the end, he was in the publisher's debt, and John Adams, Franklin, and others were given the credit of his anonymous work for a time. He became famous in 6 months. I remember another British patriotic journalist, a pious man whose income in the wartime increased 8-fold. Paine, instead of exploiting his new fame, threw up his journalistic work, closed a profitable school he had, and took a musket in the autumn of 1776. He was made aide-de-camp to General Greene, and as spirits flagged, he plied his pen amidst the distractions and affairs of camp. The first outcome was the famous Crisis, beginning, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. Tyranny, like hell, is most easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap we esteem too lightly. 'Tis dreariness only that gives everything its value." It had a prodigious effect, and 7 other crises followed. In April of 1777, Paine was appointed secretary to the Committee of Foreign Affairs. His chief business was to maintain communication between Congress and the army, and once he carried his message in an open boat under the guns of the British fleet. For 2 years he thus served, writing his powerful appeals to the nation as occasion required. Had he followed the example of so many other literary and commercial patriots, firmly secured his profit upon and built upon his success, he would have become a great American writer, possibly a statesman, instead of a dirty little atheist. But a courageous indiscretion in 1779 began the story of his undoing in America. One of the commissioners sent to France, Dean, was corrupt, and Paine denounced him in the Pennsylvania packet. He could not do so without betraying an action of France which ought not to be published, and Dean was his friends naturally turned the attack by accusing Paine of violation of his official oath of secrecy and grave injury to the nation. The story has been often told. It is enough here to say that Sir Leslie Stephen, who figures as a villain in Conway's life, says in his article on Paine in the Dictionary of National Biography that Dean was a rogue and that Paine's conduct was quite honorable, and there was no breach of oath. But Paine, threatened with dismissal, had to resign, and a time of comparative distress began. The man who was sacrificed to the nation, the copyright of his finest writings, could not pay for his boots. He became a clerk in a private office, while smaller men went on to glory. He was in debt to the printer for his patriotic works. He had to beg the Executive Council of Pennsylvania to help him to get out of a collected edition of his works. The French minister secretly offered him $1,000 a year for his pen, and Paine rejected it. So the minister lied about him, saying that he had accepted and been discharged for incompetence. But Paine had not yet written on religion. He counted himself a member of the Church of England, and men were still free to recognize his splendid service to the nation. The University of Pennsylvania made him an M.A. The Pennsylvania Assembly appointed him its clerk. It was he who wrote the preamble to the Act for the Abolition of Slavery of that state, just as it seems it was he who wrote the clause for the abolition of slavery which Jefferson tried to get incorporated into the Constitution. He was comfortable for a season, and when funds ran low and he proposed the voluntary subscriptions for carrying on the war, he headed it with 500 of his own scanty dollars. When his term of office expired, he coaxingly offered to go as unpaid secretary with Colonel Laurens to France, to get a loan from the French government. He was received with great distinction at Paris, and it was to him and Franklin that the loan was entrusted. But of course, Laurens and his political friends got all the prestige and the reward. Paine did not receive a cent for his mission. By the end of the war, Paine found himself, after 7 years, zealous and most profitable service of his adopted country. After writing works which still figure in the history of literature, poorer and with less prospect than in 1776, some people, pro-British, found that he had been mercenary. There was no need for him to say, "My pen and my soul have ever gone together." He was a poor man at the end of it, and he was a sober man with few pleasures. Washington, who knew all that he had done, got for him a salary of $800 a year. He drew it for 1 year to continue to use his pen in the national service. He bought a very small house with 1/5 of an acre of ground at Bordertown, New Jersey, and devoted himself to the dream which haunted him all of his life, of making mechanical inventions and scientific research. Washington, still very friendly with him, felt that his poverty was a reproach to the nation, and something was done for him. Pennsylvania awarded him $2,500, and Congress $3,000. The state of New York gave him the forfeited property of a royalist at New Rochelle, a handsome house and 277 acres of land. He was comfortable and buried out of sight. One wonders if there was anything in the personality of Paine that kept him out of the race for honors in the new nation, but the most impartial inquiry can find nothing but his ideals. Coming so recently from England, he had, of course, not the same moral status as the others. Legally, he was an American. He was one of the British colonists who declared their independence and won it. Moreover, he had ability as a political thinker, as well as in literature. At Franklin's house, he was one of the group which most seriously discussed what the new Constitution was to be. Franklin, Washington, and Jefferson highly esteemed him. Almost to the end of his life, Jefferson consulted him on most important issues. He wrote with great ability on political theory and finance. Yet no one proposed him as a delegate for Congress. As I said, his recent coming to America may have counted, but Conway makes it clear that from the start he was disappointed at the direction taken by the leaders of the new republic. They were not bold enough, not radical enough for him. They still looked to old world models of institutions. It seemed to him that they were setting up a new king in a new House of Lords, and there was already a good deal of corruption and slimy ambition in the game of politics. Paine turned from constitution making to mechanical contrivances. He got the idea of making bridges of iron. He was not quite the first to have the idea, but the earlier designs had been forgotten, and Paine was really a pioneer. Franklin thought the idea good, and Paine's plans were seriously considered by a committee of the Pennsylvania Assembly, which did nothing, apparently for practical reasons. So Paine thought that he would try the old world. The American Revolution had had mighty echoes in Europe. France was stirred to its depths. In England, the radicals who had tried to stop the bloodshed had found new courage. Skepticism, deism, was beginning in both countries to engender its usual consequence: literal humanitarianism and progress. The sleepy old countries were awakened. The new country seemed about to go to sleep. Paine took ship for Europe. And that is the end of Chapter 2, and I think we'll stop there for Part 2, and I will see you again in Part 3 for Chapter 3. Thanks for listening.